Hello, good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Should we do it slightly louder? Good morning? Y- No, I mean the microphone, not you. That's very childish, isn't it? Can I hear it again? No. Good morning, everyone. Very warm welcome today on this drizzly, raining Saturday here in Sheffield. I am sorry about the weather. We tried to get rain instead, but we ran out of budget, so better luck next year, yeah? No, really good. There's so many of you here. I'm really happy there are quite a lot of you. It's quite filled, the building, so I hope that feels safe for everyone, COVID-wise. And if not, then let us know, and we'll try to adapt things a little bit. So good morning. My name is Tim. I'm one of the organizers of this very first Mental Health and Christianity conference here in Sheffield. Yes, there was one or two people who were awake. Very good. It's really nice to hold it this year. Sorry, I need to ask. Can you hear me well? Yeah, good. Okay. It's really nice to do. It's really nice you're here. I know some people traveled quite far. I know from Manchester. Is Manchester the farthest away so far? No. Further away? No. No? Oh, okay. You win. You win. Well done. Good. I just want to introduce you. There's quite a few people. I'll quickly introduce them so you know where they are. If you've got any questions during the day, and then we properly get started. We'll start with Jonathan. Jonathan is there. Jonathan, maybe you can stand up and just wave at everyone or sing a song. That's Jonathan. Jonathan is one of the organizers. If you've got any questions, Jonathan might be able to help you, especially around food. Yeah, he'll be able to answer your questions. Dan, who's in the back, who does the technology. Dan, can you wave? Brilliant, he's there. So for technical questions, do see Dan. Then there's Beth, who's here. She'll help me host, and she'll be available for questions. Ben, who's just come to play piano this morning for us, so thank you, Ben, that's brilliant. And then Louisa, you all met Louisa downstairs at the table, and she will come up. We're expecting a few more people, but we're going to start. Good. You've all got a drink, I hope. If you've not got a drink, if you just arrived, do get one. Don't feel like you can't get one now. We've got a really good lineup of speakers, I hope, today. I think. No, I know we do. We've got a really good keynote speaker as well. About that more later. Just to say that this conference has been sort of 3 years in the making. And then COVID happened. I don't know if you noticed, but there was this thing happening. So we had to restart, and suddenly, out of nowhere, the organization went very quickly with some of the volunteers. We organize this ourselves, but we do it in partnership with the Sheffield Methodist Church, the URC North. I say that correctly? Yorkshire, that's what I said. And the Diocese of Sheffield and the Sheffield Methodist District. And then given his time as well, and I think you've seen this slide already. But it's great that everyone wanted to partner up. It is a bit of a trial today. We're just trialing this to see how it goes. We would like to do it again next year. So thank you very much for being guinea pigs today. And at the end of the day, we've got a questionnaire, so do fill that in if you would like to. Good, I think I'll hand over to you, and then I'll come back to you in a moment.
And the reward for the questionnaire is a carrot, of course, seeing as you're all guinea pigs. So before we start, there are some announcements to make for the day. There's a timetable that should be on your tables, so please just have a quick review of that and make sure that you are familiar with the timings, although most things will be announced, but just make sure you know what's happening when. And as you can see, the workshop titles and locations are on the paper, and there are signs with the names of the rooms around the building. But I think for many of you, it's probably the first time you've been in this building, so just as a quick heads up, the creche is that room there, which you can go to through those doors. The Emmaus room you can access most easily through those doors, but between those two doors, it's actually a circle corridor behind, so you can access easily. The toilets are also accessible through both of those, with the disabled toilet being accessible most easily through that door. There are more toilets downstairs should you need them. We're also using the upper room, which you would need to get to through that door. We can make sure that somebody can guide you if you need that. And the other workshop is taking place in here. Lunch will be served downstairs. Don't feel like you need to use the stairs if you prefer to use the lift. It's there for you if you need it. We're very happy to have a stand from the local Oxfam shop here at the back with Rosemary. womaning. Sorry, I didn't catch the name of your... And Grace, with Rosemary and Grace womaning the stand. So please go and spend all of your pennies on that stand because they've got some lovely stuff there. There's also a mental health quiz. So if you can pick one up and then fill it in, you can drop it at the front with your name on it. Make sure you put your name on it so that at the end of the day we can pick a winner and give out a prize. There is no scheduled fire drill for today. So if you hear the fire alarm, then please do follow the signs for the nearest exit. Any further questions, either now or during the day, then please come and find one of us. Tim's pointed out all of those people who can help you as best as possible. And we hope that you have a really good time today.
So, any questions at this point? Anyone worried at this point? No? Are you looking forward to it at this point? Are you done? No? Okay, good. We've got a bit of time before we start with the first speaker, which is great. And I thought it would be nice to just take some time for ourselves here to do something for our mental health and do something for our mental health, perhaps from a Christian point of view. After all, it's a Christian and mental health conference. So I would say sit comfortably. I'll join you because I'll be the only one standing. Sit comfortably, however you like, yeah. And I will ask Ben maybe to play maybe a bit of calm music in a little while, and then I'll walk you through a very short mindfulness meditation together, and then after that we sing a song together. Just to explain, the whole idea of this moment is for us to switch gears, to focus on why we're here, where we are now, and to let go of those things that we might not need right now, that we can leave behind for today. Then after that we sing a song together, and we sing the song over and over and over until you might think, has it not finished yet? And then we'll sing a little bit longer. The whole point of this song is that we sing it so that it's not just about the text or the music, but it becomes something inside. It's an opportunity to connect, to turn towards God. And after that we're done, and then the conference will really start. Is that okay? So make yourself comfortable and enjoy this moment. This moment is for you. So as you're sitting down, feel welcome to close your eyes. But you don't have to, as long as you feel safe. And to just take a moment to think about the things that are keeping you busy right now in your life. And imagine that you can put them down on the ground, next to you, beside you. You're not letting go, you're just putting them down for a moment. As we take these few minutes, just to invite you to try and focus and bring your attention to God, whatever form or shape that takes for you. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to pray. You don't need to think of anything. Just bring your awareness to what God is for you. If your mind wanders, don't judge yourself. Just bring it back. All you need to do right now is focus on the image of God. So before we sing, I would just like to read out a line of Father Roger of Tasia, who said, "Spending time in silence with God is already prayer." Amen. The text is on the wall, and do feel free to keep your eyes shut if you want to. That was nice. Thank you very much. I realize that's quite a hard transition for you. Wake up, everyone. Good. Thank you very much. I hope that was okay for you. If you really like Tasia and you're in Sheffield, tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, St. Mark's, Broomhill, you're very welcome. I didn't do this to promote that, just to be clear. Good. Switching gears again. I hope that was good for you. Switching gears again. I'm really looking forward to announce our keynote speaker. She doesn't know this, nor do you, but I think it's been sort of 4.5 years in the making, thinking of a reason to invite her to come and speak here. She doesn't know this, but as we were sent as chaplains on a day on spirituality, and you spoke there, and it was really good. So I'm just hyping you up. So good luck with that. should I say doctor? Is it doctor or is it professor? What do we say? Associate professor, Dr Tasia Scrutton. She's an associate professor at Leeds. She wrote a book, actually more than one. Now, how many did you write? Two. Oh, no one knows that. More than two. Her book is up here and actually is one of the prizes for the quiz. So really, you really want to win this one. Just a bit of motivation there. You're going to speak to us this morning about... There you go. Very good. So can I have a really warm welcome, maybe a round of applause for Tasia. I say that, but we need to switch gear as well.
There we go. Thank you very much. Oh, no, I don't need one, I don't think. So, hello, and thank you very much for coming. It's really absolutely lovely to be here. And I hope the talk lives up to Tim's very kind introduction to it. I should be clicking in that direction and hope that that changes, but I don't think. Ah, brilliant, excellent, thank you. Shall I just wave if it's not working? Brilliant. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, oh, no, we've gone too far now. About several Christian theologies of mental illness. You might wonder what a Christian theology of mental illness is. Well, it's really any kind of Christian way of making sense of mental illness and the role of faith, the role of God, the role of suffering, the role of evil in the world. So some really common theological interpretations of mental illness. We're only going to look at two today, but just to give you a sort of sense of some different ones within different communities that I've come across. One is that mental illness is a result of sin or an absence of faith. And I actually thought that this would be quite uncommon in this country. To be honest, I thought it would be more common in the US. But the more and more research I did on it, the more it turned out that it's actually also quite common here. It's more common in some evangelical communities. And I say some because it's easy to kind of, generalize and treat a religious group as monolithic, and it's really not. So some is doing a lot of work here. Some sociologists describe it as the Christian view of mental illness, and this is kind of really unfair. And one of the things I'm going to do is talk a little bit about this interpretation, but also talk about one of the other interpretations, a potentially transformative view, just to give you a sense of the really quite big differences between some different theologies of mental illness. The second one is that mental illness, and often people are talking about depression, but then it gets generalized to other forms of mental illness, that mental illness is a symptom of demonic possession or demonic oppression. The language used is very complex. There are often different things going on in different contexts. Sometimes that's found in Pentecostal and charismatic churches particularly, and sometimes it's kind of a version of the sin interpretation, really, because the person is thought to be exposed to demonic influences because they've sinned or because they lack faith or something like that. So sometimes, not always, it's basically a sin interpretation with a sort of demonic bit of icing or something like that. Demonic icing. A third interpretation that I came across quite a lot, especially reading the way that Mother Teresa, St. Teresa of Calcutta's experience of mental distress was interpreted, is that it's a dark night of the soul. That is, far from meaning that the person is sinful or lacks faith, it's actually a sign of holiness and a sign of closeness to God. And this really draws on St. John of the Cross's 16th century mystical idea about kind of purgative suffering and a period of mental illness being part of spiritual growth for particularly contemplative people. This being applied to mental illness, I think, is... I had a PhD student who interviewed people about this and came up with some interesting conclusions, but she found it tends to be more common in Roman Catholic circles, but particularly older generation. So I think, especially if you look at kind of pre-Vatican II theology of suffering, you can kind of see where it's coming out of. So that was her finding. Of course, it was only a small sample size, but I think that's broadly right. And then a final one that we're going to look at alongside sin in a little bit more depth is a potentially transformative view. That's a very fancy way of saying that mental illness might be considered undesirable in itself, but nevertheless good can come out of it, and that in a Christian context tends to be made sense of in terms of God bringing good out of evil. Right, so the sort of the Felix culpa, the fall resulted in the incarnation, and so a bad thing happened, but God brought something even better out of it. And I think that the underlying thought is common in Christian contexts, and there are Christian ways of making sense of it, but it's also found more generally that people talk about their experience of mental illness as having ultimately helped them in some way, perhaps given them a greater appreciation of beauty, perhaps given them more empathy towards others, perhaps increased insight into themselves. So we'll be looking at that. I put a duck rabbit at the top. That's Wittgenstein's picture of some of you might see a duck and some of you might see a rabbit, and you might be able to switch between them. But I think this captures something about how important interpretation is to our experience. So it really shapes our experience. We see mental illness as something, and that affects how we understand it, what treatments we might advise people to take or that we might take ourselves, how much we trust doctors, how much we trust clergy, whether we think that meaning can come out of it, and so on. So that's the point of the duck rabbit. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to look at the first interpretation, the sin interpretation, and also the potentially transformative interpretation today. So I think Jessie Grondin puts the sin interpretation, she really hits the nail on the head when she describes it in this way. When dealing with people in the church, some see mental illness as a weakness, a sign you don't have enough faith. They said to me, it's a problem of the heart. You need to straighten things out with God. They make depression out to be a sin because you don't have the joy in your life a Christian is supposed to have. So she's talking about her own experiences of having depression and of being in churches and someone saying something like that to her. Now, it sometimes gets called a lay interpretation of mental illness. And I think that's a bit unfair because I've heard people say that clergy have told people that they're depressed because they lack faith. I've seen, church websites where that's the impression that's being given. And you also get kind of Christian psychologists and Christian psychiatrists who put forward this kind of view as well. So kind of professionals who have a degree of authority rather than simply people, as it were, in the pews So I think actually lay theology is being scapegoated in a way, that actually this is going on in quite professional circles as well. So just one of many examples of this, and I will look at another example a bit later on, is someone called Ray Harkham, who's a well-known psychologist, and he's written a book called God's Prescription for Your Mental Health. Smile if you truly believe your religion, or something like that. And he says, a respected social worker once said to me about a mutual friend, if she would just start thinking about others instead of herself all the time, she would not have so many physical and psychological problems. Indeed, this one brief proposition summarizes the central lesson of this book. God's prescription, the highway to mental health of individuals and of society, is the highway, God's way, which includes selfless devotion and service to others. So you can see this kind of two-way thing where on the one hand, it seems fairly benign. He's saying, well, if you're selfless, then you're more likely to have greater well-being. But the flip side of that, of course, is if you don't have greater well-being, then it means that you haven't been selfless, that in fact you've been selfish, and so on. I'm a philosopher and a theologian rather than an anthropologist, so I'm going to be quite judgmental about things. I want to know what to believe and why believe it. So I'm not going to try and maintain any neutrality here. But I think it's good to try and understand where people are coming from, at least, before you sort of say, I don't think this is a very good view. And I think there are different motivations, and again, we'll come on to that. But I think one is the passage about the fruits of the Spirit, and that one of the fruits of the Spirit is joy. And so there is a puzzle for Christians, at least from certain traditions, and I really think Grondin draws this out, that if you don't have the joy in your life that a Christian is supposed to have, what's gone wrong? Why don't you have that fruit of the Spirit? So I think there are non-religious motivations for it as well, but I think if you like, that's a kind of Christian motivation. That's a puzzle that people are trying to solve, and that's why they end up with this kind of view. Could we have the next slide? So what's actually meant by the claim that mental illness is a result of sin? Well, one thing to note is that sin isn't just doing bad things on this kind of view, but it often includes an absence of faith. So if you like, faith becomes moralized in a particular way. Jameson, who wrote a book about her experiences of bipolar disorder, writes, for example, I received thousands of letters from people following the publication of my book. Most of them were supportive, but many were exceedingly hostile. A striking number said that I deserved my illness because I was insufficiently Christian and the devil had gotten hold of me. More prayer, not medication, was the answer. So here we see that it's kind of faith, faith rather than you did a bad thing, kind of conception of sin. It's voluntaristic. By voluntaristic, I mean it emphasizes human free will, choice, the extent of our choice, the extent to which we can choose things, to a very high degree. And certainly a lot of the literature that you get that puts forward this view is self-help literature. So there is an there's almost necessarily an absence of language about grace in self-help literature because it's about self-help. And it tends to be voluntaristic. It tends to say you can choose, you do have free will over this situation. So it's highly voluntaristic. And Minerth and Meyer, who are two psychiatrists who have written a book called Happiness as a Choice, which is all about overcoming depression through faith and kind of Christian CBT almost, but who put forward this sin view. For example, say that mental illness, and particularly depression, they say very rarely has a biological basis. And they say that saying that your depression has a biological basis is just an excuse to avoid facing up to your behavioral and emotional irresponsibilities as the cause of depression. So that is pretty extreme. I can see your faces that kind of like, oh my goodness. And this is a best-selling book. This is a best-selling self-help book. It tends to be gendered. This is not going to surprise us. So someone called Matthew Stanford did quite a small study, and he found that women are more likely than men to be told that their mental illness is the result of sin or absence of faith. So it is gendered. There haven't been any studies about LGBT people that I know of, but my sense is from purely anecdotal evidence, because I've come and given talks to lots of people, and they've come up to me afterwards and said, I had this happen to me, is that gay people are much more likely to be told. And again, this is no surprise to us. Could we have the next slide, please? So this is where I get judgy, I get kind of philosophical. Is it good theology? Well, I think it's not good theology, and here's why. One is you'd expect good theology to be true to lived experience. If it's not true to lived experience, there's a bit of a problem, because we know that experience tends to tell us something about the nature of the world. Con Drury, who was a student of Wittgenstein's and also a psychiatrist in Dublin, has this very interesting passage. He's reflecting on his experiences as a psychiatrist, and he says that we, you and I, might one day be admitted to a mental hospital in a state of despairing melancholia or foolish mania, might become deluded or hallucinated. That is a thought not easily to be entertained. We like to think that either our intelligence or our willpower or our piety would save us from such a fate. I heard a sermon some time ago in which the preacher stated that the great increase in mental illness at the present time was due to the decay of faith. Anyone, he said, who had a firm belief in God would never suffer from nerves or a mental breakdown. Alas. So one thing he's drawing attention to here is it's just not true to experience, that people who have mental illnesses are more likely to be sinful or more likely to lack faith. If anything, they're more likely to have had bad things happen to them. I think it's also a really interesting passage, because one thing it's drawing attention to is one of the motivations for this kind of view, which I think is a motivation for Christians and for religious people, but I think it's a motivation for secular people as well. And that's that if there's a terrifying possibility in front of us, one day I might have a mental breakdown and end up in a psychiatric hospital. One way of sort of protecting ourselves, or feeling that we're protecting ourselves from that possibility, is to say, well, it won't happen to me. I'm too clever for that to happen to me. I've got too much willpower. I'm too pious. I've got too much faith. So it could be a kind of self-protective strategy. That could be why people have this kind of view. I think a potential other reason for thinking that this isn't good theology is that voluntarism, the idea that we have oodles of free will all of the time about everything, is really quite similar to Pelagianism, which is, for those of you who did a theology course or something like that, which is a heresy that Augustine of Hippo opposed, and that got decided by the church that it was heretical. That was really because it downplayed the role of divine grace by emphasizing human free will too much. But I think one thing that is a corollary of that is that Pelagians and voluntarists more generally tend to be very harsh. They tend to be very kind of unforgiving, because if you have a lot of choice over something, then you can more easily say that it's the person's fault. So emphasizing choice and emphasizing moral responsibility go hand in hand. So I think Pelagius actually sounds really similar to kind of the Christian voluntarist today, when he says, it affords endless comfort to transgressors of the divine law if they are able to believe that their failure to do something is due to inability rather than disinclination. If you look at people like Minerth and Meyer, the psychiatrists we look at, when they're saying, well, it's an excuse so that you avoid facing up to your emotional and behavioral responsibilities, it sounds very, very similar. You have a lot of choice, it's your choice, and therefore you're responsible. So I think the fact that it's so similar to Pelagianism should maybe theologically give us a few concerns about it, apart from anything else. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Are they helpful? So these kinds of views are sometimes defended because they're thought to be helpful. So in particular, it's thought that by emphasizing choice, by emphasizing free will, it actually gives the person hope. So Jay Adams, who I suspect most people have heard of, says that when we say that depression is a result of unbiblical and sinful reactions to problems, it sounds unloving and harsh. Actually, the opposite is true. When we realize that it's our reactions that are causing the depression, we can then deal with those reactions God's way. This realization gives us hope that by God's help, a solution is possible. So he's saying, actually saying it's the result of unbiblical and sinful reactions is more loving because it gives people the sense that overcoming it by having more faith and so on is possible. So it gives hope. But I think this is, I think the first thing to note is that quite a lot of different Christian interpretations of mental illness give hope as well. Medical interventions give hope. Psychological interventions, talking therapies, all of these things give hope. So this kind of view is not unique in giving hope. So if there's a range of things that give hope, then this is not unique. Most interventions do give hope. Hardly anything says, oh, you're depressed, you're stuck with it. That's not, that's just not true. The other thing to note is that guilt and feelings of worthlessness are actually a symptom of depression and of a number of other mental illnesses. So I think very often what's happening is that people feel guilt already. They don't even know what the guilt is about. They feel guilty, they feel worthless. The psychiatrist and philosopher Thomas Fuchs has a quotation. Someone he interviews says the following about this: "It comes from below, from the gut, like a terrible oppression rising to the chest. Then a pressure arises, like a crime that I have committed. I feel it like a wound on my chest, that is my tortured conscience. Then this attracts my memories, and I have to think again of all that I have missed or done wrong in my life." So people with mental health problems will often be overly scrupulous. They will often feel guilty and worthless and be looking for some reason for that. So in a way, they're kind of sitting ducks for this kind of interpretation that says, yes, actually you're sinful, yes, actually you've done something wrong. So it's simply validating those already problematic and often unfounded feelings that are common in mental illness. And of course it could exacerbate them, and I think we can see it as a kind of victim blaming. It's really kind of saying, you're feeling guilty, that is because you are guilty. Could we have the next slide? Thank you. Again, are they helpful? Well, they're quite dangerous, I think, because they discourage people from seeking medical and psychological interventions, from taking tablets, from seeking talk therapy. There's one very sad case, an example of someone who's called Cynthia, which I think is a pseudonym. And she's diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and the minister at her church persuades her not to take the tablets, to throw them away. And she believes it's the result of her lack of faith, and so praying more can help. And she's found weeks later, dazed, confused, and living in the street. You know, we don't know what happened in between, but the effects were pretty severe. It alienates people from their church communities. So church communities are often thought to be a potential source of huge support for people undergoing mental health problems. But if people can't tell their friends in church what they're going through for fear of the kind of reaction that they'll get, then in fact they're alienated. They're not able to access that support. So someone called Joy Sweatman, who is the wife of a pastor who suffers from mental illness, says several church people told my husband that I did not have enough faith or must have a poor relationship with God, or that my mental illness was a form of demonic possession. Because attitudes that still prevail, I am cautious about sharing my experiences. I fear people will consider me a lesser child of God. So she's really kind of alienated from her community. And finally, I think, well, I could go on, but I think another problem worth highlighting is it deflects attention away from the social causes of mental illness. So we know there's a correlation between poverty, between discrimination, between being a victim of discrimination, between being an asylum seeker or a refugee and suffering from mental health problems. We know that there's that correlation. We know that people are more likely to suffer from mental health problems if they're poor, if they're discriminated against, if they're in an unstable situation. The evidence for that is overwhelming. If we start problematizing the individual, saying it's this person, it's because they've sinned, we're deflecting attention away from those social causes. I'm a Roman Catholic, so I had to put a picture of the Pope. But he does say something interesting about sin here. He says, the unjust distribution of goods persists, creating a situation of social sin that cries out to heaven and limits the possibilities of fuller life for so many of our brethren. So one thing is that the idea of social sin here, the things that cause poverty, the things that cause oppression, and these seem to be causes of mental illness. So one thing, I think, if we're going to talk about sin at all in the context of mental illness, I think we ought to be talking about social sin, not about individual sin. Could we have the next slide? How am I doing for time? How am I doing for time, Tim? Okay, good, excellent. So I want to kind of cheer you up now. Well, a little bit, moderately, tiny bit. And have a look at potentially transformative accounts of mental illness. And one reason I really want to do this is because I think they're quite rich. I think they will actually be familiar to you once I start talking about them. And also because I think Christianity gets a bad press because of the sin interpretation. That's the interpretation that people remember. That's the interpretation that sociologists, for example, talk about when they talk about Christianity. So I really want to talk about a potentially transformative view. And I'm going to start with a Dutch psychologist and Roman Catholic priest who spent most of his time in America and who wrote a huge number of quite autobiographical books, sort of actually was impressive simply for being so open about himself. And he's called Henri Nouwen. And he went through a period of depression, quite severe depression. It was time limited, but it was severe, as a result of the breakup of a very close friendship with someone he had become very close to, another man, and he was a gay man, so that he was in love with this man, but he was also very good friends with him, and he became too needy, too invested, and the friendship had to be cut. And that was the catalyst for this breakdown. He keeps this journal, which he later publishes, which is well worth reading, called The Inner Voice of Love. And at the end of the journal, he makes the following remark. So he writes this some months later. Reading my journal makes me aware of the radical changes I have undergone. I have moved through anguish to freedom, through depression to peace, through despair to hope. My depression certainly was a time of purification for me. My heart, ever questioning my goodness, value, and worth, has become anchored in a deeper love and thus less dependent on the praise and blame of those around me. It has also grown into a greater ability to give love without always expecting love in return. What once seemed such a curse has become a blessing. All the agony that threatened to destroy my life now seems like fertile ground for greater trust, stronger hope, and deeper love. This idea of fertile ground, I think, is really at the heart of potentially transformative views. You get this over and over again in the language that people use when they're describing usually their own experiences of some kind of mental illness. And often, well, usually they're saying it's still inherently undesirable. I'm still not pleased I went through mental illness. Not always, but usually they're saying that. But nevertheless, that it was fertile ground for some of these things like greater trust, stronger hope, and deeper love. So kind of maybe greater emotional maturity or something like that in Nervan's case. A potentially transformative view has a naturalistic etiology. So by that I just mean that it's not caused by demons, or it's not caused by the dark night of the soul. Kind of mental distress is caused by God directly. In the case of a potentially transformative view, it's the biological, psychological, and social causes that are emphasized. It's not thought to have a particularly theological etiology. It's not caused by demons. It's not caused by sin. It's just caused by all of the kind of things that most people think cause it. But what's key is the forward-looking element. God brings good out of it. So rather than looking backward to what the cause is, it looks forward to what good can come out of it. Could we have the next slide, please? In the case of Nervan, some of the goods that came out of it were greater happiness with the self and quite a lot of resolution of issues surrounding homosexuality, I think, particularly. So he knew he was gay. I think it would be fair to say he was homophobic early on in his life. He was harsh and judgmental, presumably about himself as well as about others. After his experience of depression, he became very supportive of gay people in monogamous relationships, particularly. And he started to talk quite differently about sexuality. He started to say things like, all human life is a sexual life, whether you're celibate or not. And he talked about bringing his body home, so it was part of his theology that the whole self is a Christian. It's not that the sexuality side is kind of split off from that. So he seems to have changed a lot in his views of his own sexuality and other sexualities. He remained celibate. Parker Palmer, so Nervan Catholic priest, Parker Palmer, Quaker theologian, has, I think, what you might call a potentially transformative view. He says, you seem to look, his therapist said, you seem to look upon depression as the hand of an enemy trying to crush you. Do you think you could see it instead as the hand of a friend pressing you down to the ground on which it's safe to stand? Something in me knew knew that deep down was the direction of wholeness. So for him it was to do with becoming more grounded, more kind of humble in the literal sense of that. And then a final account I was struck by is an anonymous account I just found in the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience archives. And this was a woman who lost her husband, and she went through a deep depression after that. And she says, the shock and deep depression took some years to live through, but gradually my mind became conscious of a more acute sense of the beauties that are around us and a thankfulness which I was not aware of before. So I think a further thing that people often talk about actually is a heightened appreciation of beauty coming out of experiences of depression in particular. Could I have the next slide, please? So, again, my kind of judgmental philosophy and theology hat. Oh, I think we've lost the slides. How much do we like this interpretation? Well, I'm much more of a fan of it than the sin interpretations, as you can probably tell. It rings true to some people's experience. So I think one thing that strikes me is that most of the material that you find sin interpretations in tends to be written by people who aren't themselves going through mental health issues. So it tends to be people who are giving guidance or advice or simply just judging people who do have mental health issues, or it tends to be self-help books, again written from a kind of outsider perspective to the experience. With a potentially transformative view, it tends to be autobiographical. That's where I found most of these kinds of accounts, with some exceptions. You know, the medium is the message. The medium does make a difference. And so the fact that it rings true to some people's experience, that it's coming out of the experiences of people with mental health issues, seems important to me. It certainly gives hope, right? Because what it's saying is even this experience, which is a horrible experience, can have some meaning, some good can come out of it. It isn't always just a total and unpleasant waste of time. So it's certainly a hopeful interpretation. And some people criticize this view because they say, well, it's not really a Christian view, it's just a kind of, at least the sin interpretation is a properly Christian, because it's talking about sin. You get this potentially transformative view kind of throughout Christian but also non-Christian literature. You just get it when people describe their experiences. But actually, it does make a lot of sense on a Christian view. So the idea that God brings good out of evil in the resurrection. Okay, the idea that God brings good out of the evil of the fall in the case of the incarnation. So I think there is this repeated motif in Christianity that God brings good out of evil, and I think that is very deeply theological and very deeply Christian. And it seems to me that a potentially transformative view is part of this. I think it can go wrong. And interestingly, I think the ways in which it can go wrong relate to the ways in which it can become similar to a sin view. So, for example, in some self-help literature, a potentially transformative view is put forward, but it's done in quite a prescriptive way. So rather than the author saying, this was what my experience was, they're saying, this can be what your experience is, as long as you do the right things. As long as you pray enough or see it in the right way or make sure you go into it with the right attitude, then you too can have these positive benefits. There's a book by someone called Thomas More, not the historical Thomas More, the recent one, and he says, for example, you can still discover new resources in yourself and a new outlook on life. And he gives examples of horrible things that might happen to you, where as long as you kind of follow his advice, you can still discover new resources in life. And these things are genuinely horrible things. He talks about rape, but he also talks about severe mental illness as well. And he says, look, you can discover new resources in yourself. So again, that seems quite voluntaristic. It seems to emphasize choice and free will too much. And it seems to bright side the experience of mental illness. I think also it deflects attention away from the social causes of mental illness, and we really ought to worry about that. I do think these problematic things can be avoided, and I think they need to be avoided, because otherwise a potentially transformative view can really become a sort of soft version of a sin view of mental illness. It needs to be emphasized that suffering is always an evil. I think that's a really important theological emphasis. Otherwise, we start to bright side things. We start to say, this is in fact a good, what's happened to you is a good, you just need to look at it in the right way. And I think we need to be non-prescriptive. So I think as soon as we start saying everyone can experience mental illness as transformative, as long as you approach it in the right way, it actually becomes problematic. I think the best literature on this is literature that's quite descriptive, that kind of simply describes what the person themselves experienced. And that kind of, reading that kind of narrative can give someone hope without putting the same pressure on them that they ought to be experiencing these wonderful things at that particular time. Brilliant, thank you. Ah, there we are. I finished. If you'd like to buy my book, but it's already here. It came out a couple of years ago. I think you can get it on Amazon. Came out with SCM Press, so you can certainly get it on their website. I found out this week it's being translated into Portuguese, which I'm really pleased about. If you would like to read it in Portuguese, you'll soon be able to. And I think it's currently about £20, but the publisher said there might be a discount for people if I gave talks to them. So if you want the discount, I'm not sure it's that much, to be honest, then maybe get in touch with Tim and he can, sorry Tim, or get in touch with me directly. You can just Google me and I'll see what I can do. But thank you very much for listening, and I hope that was interesting. And yeah, thank you.
You steal it? No. Oh, you saved it. Can I? Thank you very much. That was really, really good. I just realized I forgot to say something really important in the start of the day. Can you hear me? And that is to say that we try to respect each other's views. Feels like I'm saying it a bit too late. No, but it's not just for you, obviously, it's for the whole day. We've got a whole range of different people doing different workshops with different experiences, and you are all here with your own thoughts, feelings, and experiences as well of life in general, and perhaps mental health. So just to say, everyone is welcome, but it's also okay to take a stance as long as we respect each other. So I should have said that before. Thank you very much. That was really good. It was just as good as it was 4.5 years ago. I was very pleased that Henry Nouwen, which is his name, was still in there as a Dutchman. As a fellow Dutchman, I could really appreciate that. Did I pronounce his name right? No. But that's okay. No one does in this country, so don't worry about it. It's Henry Nouwen, if you want to know. But there you go, for everyone. But he wrote a lot of books, no? So he's very well known. Your book is available on Amazon. It was £19 something, that's correct. It's also the price, just to say again, so if you want to save yourself about £20, fill in your quiz correctly and you might be able to win it, in which case you can spend £20 at the stall in the back with Oxfam, yes? Can I invite you to, we're going to have a break in a minute. I just need to mention one or two things. Once we have our break, you're free to roam a bit about, yeah, feel free to roam. Do feel free to browse the stall in the back. Just to say that they can only take cash money. So there are 2 cash machines down the road. at the Co-op and Sainsbury's. We probably don't have time to go now, but during lunchtime we have. So if you go there and take out £50 at least, yeah. Okay. Have I done enough, Rosemary? Is that enough? Yeah, yeah, okay, good. And I don't get a commission. Just to let you know, coffees and teas in a moment. After that, I'll just do a quick announcement that you can go to the workshop rooms, just to kind of reiterate. The Emmaus room is through that door, straight into the next room, straightforward. The Emmaus room, I think, Andy, you're starting off there. Top of my head, is that correct? Yeah. You've got it all on the tables. Then the crash is through that door, left. That's with Sally Ross. And then Jeremy is the hardest one to find. But, you know, it's hard to find, but it's a very high quality workshop. So it's also through that door, and you keep on walking up the steps. I will be around there to help people guide if you go to that. If you've got any questions, you know where to find us. We've got a break up till 11:40, so we're going to do a good half hour, so maybe you can actually walk, yeah, to the cash machine. Take some time to get to know each other. We left a long break on purpose, just so that you could meet perhaps some different people you've not met before. And can I say, it was okay if people want to ask you a question, yeah?
I was assuming we were going to have a question.
Would you like to do that now? Should we do, we've got a few minutes, should we do that now? It's probably me mixing things up. I'm not really good at this stuff. Jeremy, for her question. Oh, okay. Just a moment. I'll give you that one. I'll just come over, I'll go around with the microphone so everyone can hear, hopefully, what's being said.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I found that really helpful. One question I have for you, and would be interested in your point. When we talk about mental health, the breadth of the topic and the degree to which it's integrated into human experience, it's hard to pitch it, isn't it, in my experience? And you kind of teased it out well, I think, but it's still a question that when you work in psychiatry, when you work in a psychiatric hospital, as I do, you witness people's lives who are decimated over many centuries, over their lifetime often, by quite severe mental illness. And yet, I often compare it to talking about influenza. If people have a sniffle, they're over it in a day or two, aren't they? But if people have full-blooded influenza, it can go on for many, many months. And I suppose the reason I'm asking the question is because I feel very passionately about how we engage in our churches and what we actually say to people and journey alongside people when they're decimated by mental illness. And it's very difficult, isn't it? Because sometimes people don't want to say the wrong thing. But sometimes there is a tendency at times, based on the fact that we've had similar experiences, that we can become prescriptive, can't we? And while I think breakdown and breakthrough has tremendous transformational potential, it isn't always the reality for some people. So what would you say to that, really, in terms of how do we gauge quite a complex area?
I'm so glad you asked that question. We were listening to something about Mental Health Week earlier on the radio in the car, I think yesterday, and one of the things... Sorry, can everyone still hear me? Yeah. One of the things that was striking is that a lot of the advice given about mental health presupposes relatively mild or at most moderate experiences of mental illness. And I think similarly a lot of the advice given, or a lot of the examples, I mean, Naren's experience of depression was relatively time limited. You know, he wasn't, it didn't take up his entire life. And there are some people for whom it takes up their entire life. And the goods that come out of it, I mean, I have read some accounts where people still feel that some good has come out of it. But for the most part, the kinds of accounts that are best suited to a potentially transformative view are relatively mild and relatively time limited, or at least not severe forms of mental illness. And I really think we're kind of almost trying to bundle too much in when we talk about mental illness, because we're talking about the times where I've had a bit of depression and anxiety, and that's not been nice, but we're also talking about people who have schizophrenia for large amounts of their lives. And those are very, very different things. I mean, I think from a Christian perspective, we've got to think that transformation doesn't always happen in this life. You know, that it might, and that's great if it does, but we might be looking not at this life for the kinds of transformations that take place. And I'm not sure we can say anything else than that. I certainly think the problems caused are often caused by people giving too much advice and people right-siding, to use Barbara Ehrenreich's term, you know, people saying this is not really a problem, this is an opportunity. and actually it might just be a very distressing experience that's also a waste of the person's life, and it might be hard to make sense of in that. So I think we really have to think this is not just about this life. It's a great question, and I'm really glad you asked it, because I always feel that so much is just being bundled. You know, we don't talk about physical health, oh well, cold, terminal cancer in the same category, right? We differentiate, but we don't do that with mental illness at the moment for the most part.
I'm really interested in your linking of we can't talk about mental illness without talking about social issues. Yeah. And I just wondered if you'd got some examples where you see those two things working hand in hand really well.
Of people talking about mental illness?
Yeah, of maybe, I don't know, charities or people who are working to support people, mental illness, or also maybe, I don't know, lobbying, or also taking that kind of social approach.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think they're certainly out there. I think, you know, one charity I have had quite a lot to do with has actually been an asylum seeker and refugee charity who organise hosting. And they're not particularly a mental health charity, but I think people involved in work with asylum seekers and with refugees and with any other disadvantaged community end up understanding the social causes of mental illness a huge amount, and especially the role of isolation, as well as, you know, instability, having had traumatic experiences, having an uncertain future, but also the role of isolation in causing or exacerbating mental health problems. So in response to your question, the organisations that come to mind for me, but this is perhaps just because of my familiarity with them, are really ones that are kind of working on the ground with disadvantaged people and who do understand these kind of social causes of mental illness. I think the other thing I'd want to say is I don't think that the fact that mental illness has social causes rules out the possibility that often, and in a lot of cases, it also has biological causes. So I think sometimes these things are kind of set against each other. They're kind of seen as in tension. But I don't think they really are in tension. We should expect to see a lot of different causes playing a role in this kind of thing. So I don't think I don't think an emphasis on social causes should mean that we're skeptical about psychiatric medicines, for example. And I have seen people making that kind of inference. Oh, you know, it's all to do with social causes, so we shouldn't have the psychiatrists are the bad guys. They're like these people who just want to give drugs rather than sort out any social causes. Well, that's just not true. Yeah.
Thank you. Just one quick comment.
One just quick comment. I help with Christians Against Poverty, which is very much helping people in debt, but the mental problems behind an awful lot of those people are huge.
Yeah.
And it's a joy when one sees their mental health improving because their debt has been sorted out.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
It's really good.
I think we're going to have coffee and tea now. If you still have some questions, be gentle, be kind. Give Tasia some time to have coffee and tea. But I think they can still ask you a question maybe here and there, no?
Yeah,
Thank you.
definitely.
So again, thank you very much,
Thank you for your
Tasia.
questions.
Good, so everyone knows where the coffee and tea is, and I'll give a signal when it's time to go to the workshops. Good, gentle reminder for you, if you filled in your quiz paper, you can bring it to the front. Beautiful prizes to be won. I see there's some chocolate left at the stand in the back, so go buy some chocolate. Could we go to the places where the workshops are between now and 2 minutes time? Then we can start in time. That would be great.
If anyone is staying here for this workshop, it would be great, you don't have to, but it would be great if you wanted to move forward, just so we can create a more intimate atmosphere. If you don't want to be on the live stream, still remain in the seats that you were, but otherwise do feel free to move forward. Thank you. Brilliant. Well, welcome to our first set of workshops today, folks, and welcome to those joining us for this workshop on the live stream. Just a couple of minor bits of housekeeping, just for those who missed it on the way in. Again, if you'd like to remain off the live stream on video, then please sit in the far tables. And of course, this is a workshop, so it is interactive, hopefully. So that's another thing to bear in mind, that if you do share anything over the microphone, then it will go onto the live stream. So do bear that in mind. If you wish to say something that you don't want to go on the live stream, then simply don't use the microphone. But obviously, the more that we can share with those who aren't with us, then the better. But yes, I won't do any introductions because I'm sure Simon will introduce himself, but I'll just hand straight over. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? I'll just wait for my microphone to turn on. Can you hear me now? A green light has come on, that's promising. Hooray, good. I've just been hit by a sugar high from those jelly beans I bought from the Oxfam store, which I can highly recommend. But if I start speaking even more nonsense than usual, that is why. Welcome to this workshop on theology and mental distress. I'll introduce myself in a second. I just want to say a bit about what I mean by theology and mental distress, and what I mean by theology on the one hand, and what I mean by mental distress on the other hand. And then perhaps you can tell me some things you'd like to talk about under those auspices, and then I'll go on to say what I have to say, and we can get a bit of a dialogue going. So, by theology, I just mean talking about God, or talking about other stuff as it relates to God. I don't mean anything highfalutin and academic necessarily. I don't mean the doctrine of any particular church or anything like that. I mean talk about God and talk about other stuff as it relates to God. So in particular, we can talk theologically about mental illness, mental distress, as that relates to God. That mention of mental illness or mental distress brings me on to my second kind of definition. I'm talking about mental distress. By that, I mean I include things that might be diagnosed as mental illnesses by a doctor or a psychiatrist, a psychologist. But I don't mean to limit what I'm talking about to that. I mean any kind of emotional state or perceptual state that is damaging to the person, that is distressing to the person in some way. That's what I'm talking about. So I hope to have a really broad range of conversations around anything that can go up with us emotionally or perceptually, to do with our thought or our perception of the world, that has a negative impact on us. That's what I'm talking about today, or what I want us to talk about. I'm going to sit down. It feels... I feel on display, and I am on display. I'm being streamed out to the internet, but I think it would be better to sit down. A bit about myself. So I've kind of got three horses in the race of talking about these topics. Firstly, I have bipolar disorder, which is unpleasant. And it's worth emphasizing that it's unpleasant, because one of the things I want to talk about is ways in which people try to bright side, as Tasia put it in really sort of striking and I think correct terms. People try to religiously bright side mental illness sometimes. People try to say that it has a religious significance that I think it doesn't, and I think can be quite damaging to people. So that kind of got me interested in this topic. I work as a theologian. I teach and research theology at the University of Leeds, and have a particular research interest in theology and mental illness. And then I'm a lay Dominican, so a member of a Catholic religious order, and have sort of pastoral interests as well. So I'm kind of interested in all those intersections between mental distress, as experienced from a kind of first personal perspective, theology, thought about God, and then pastoral work. I'm interested in all of those and have some kind of involvement in all of those. I was umming and ahhing quite a lot about what to do at this workshop, how much of it should be presentation of my stuff, how much of it should be based on questions you've come to this event with. So with your permission, what I'm going to do is
in a second just run you through some of my recent research and the stuff I'm interested in. But I also want to have time to answer any questions you might have come to this session with. So I'm just going to pause at this point and ask if anyone has any kind of issues they'd like to be discussed at this workshop, and then we'll make sure we leave time to get to that. Is there anything around sort of theology, mental distress, mental illness that people really want to talk about? You'd feel sort of you'd missed out if you didn't get a chance to discuss today?
I think touching on some of the anguish and torture of exile, that theology of exile, particularly in a context of Afghan refugees and refugees from Ukraine. What we hear and see on the news is, we can only imagine the tip of the iceberg, but that must be the state of mental anguish, mental torture, mental distress must be catastrophic and long-term. So if we could somehow, I don't know if that's appropriate, touch on that.
It's definitely appropriate, and it's something there's such scriptural richness behind as a topic in Christian theology, right? That the experience of exile is integral to the experience of God's people in the Hebrew Bible. Just think about some of the Psalms. And I did a session a few months ago about praying with the Psalms during times of mental illness. And that poetry that comes out of that experience, which is a real experience for so many people in our world today, really can speak to people in situations of mental distress. So yeah, let's talk about that in more depth later on. That's really cool. Anything else people would, yeah? Definitely. So eating disorders and Christianity, and yeah, you're exactly right that the theme of food, the symbolism of food, is so important to the Christian life and to the Bible that we can, if we're not very careful, lose sight of how that imagery works or doesn't work for some people. So there's that issue, and then there's just the more general issue of how we as Christians support people undergoing that kind of experience, any mental illness, but an eating disorder in particular, yeah. Let's talk about that later on as well. Anything else? Yeah.
I suppose the last thing that we touched upon earlier in the previous keynote is about not just about supporting people with mental health illnesses, but also supporting churches understand that progression of it, because I know for a fact from people I've spoken to that are from the gay community, for example, that have struggled to be involved in church, and then the conversation's only just now coming forward as that being a thing. Whereas, obviously, it's not just only just happened.
Yeah. So how we provide that kind of institutional, corporate, communal support, and don't just, as there's a danger of doing, focus on individuals, definitely, yeah. Anything else? Well, let me tell you a bit about what I've been thinking about recently. So my work kind of grows out of irritation, of the experience of irritation, of being told things by very well-meaning people that are supposed to be helpful to me when I've been in times of mental distress of various sorts. So it came up a bit in Tasia's talk, this language of the dark night of the soul. Does get used quite a lot still. I mean, there is a generational aspect to it, but it hasn't by any means gone. You know, people sending me cards saying things like, I too have had the dark night of the soul. And that's just, I didn't find that helpful, but there's also a kind of baptizing of suffering, a making sacred of suffering, saying that suffering is something that comes from God or is of God. And you get similar things if, as I do, you've had experience of psychosis, so of unusual experiences or thoughts. People will sort of make out that that's an amazing opportunity for religious experience or something like that. And again, it's well-meaning. It's kind of people not quite knowing what to say in the face of something that's beyond their experience and therefore trying to see something positive about it. It's not coming from a bad place, but precisely because people are well-meaning, they need to be gently corrected, I think. And in both of these cases, so if you like the downs and the ups of bipolar disorder, I really do see this tendency to baptize suffering. That's the phrase I use. And there's a long Christian history of doing that with all sorts of suffering, baptizing suffering, of seeing pain as somehow good. And it's not difficult to see why, given the sort of themes of the Christian faith, people do that. After all, our central symbol is the cross. And some of the ways people have thought theologically about the cross have encouraged people to think that pain is good. Have encouraged people to think that what God demands of Jesus Christ is pain and suffering. That is something, if you like, God does rather than human beings do. And that, therefore, by extension, our pain is good, or our pain can be good. You get language in Paul that is read like that, sort of language about completing the sufferings of Christ. I don't think that's how Paul should be read, but it's a common reading in the tradition of reading him like that. And it has done a lot of damage to people over the centuries. People have been put on a pedestal in their pain and told that they are special to God precisely because they are in pain, which, of course, the problem with that is that it removes the imperative to see pain and suffering as things we ought to do away with, as things that are antithetical to God's will, as things that God does not want for God's children. Now, there's been a big shift in theology in, I'd say, the last century away from this, across Christian churches, across traditions. Within the tradition I'm most familiar with, which is the Western Catholic tradition, currents like liberation theology have been at the forefront of saying things like God does not want suffering. We should not read the cross as God demanding suffering of Christ. We should see this as the political victimization of one of God's prophets and stuff like that. And I think it's fair to say that in the case of physical or somatic bodily illness or distress, it is far less likely these days that someone will be told their pain is good. It's not that it doesn't happen, but there's been a significant sort of shift away from that kind of view. I think it's far less the case with mental suffering. I think people who undergo mental distress still regularly get told the kind of thing I was told. And it's interesting to reflect on why that is. How we think about God affects how we think about this, but also how we think about ourselves in relation to God, how we think about human beings, what they are, how God has made them. And I think that there's a tendency in Western thought, but Christian thought in particular, to see human beings as basically divided into two bits. So this gets called dualism. And the idea that we've got a bodily bit, which is less important, certainly less holy, less important to God. And we've got an inner, mental, spiritual bit, that is much more important to God. It's the site of my encounter with God, it's the place God meets me, and is tied up with my mind, my intellect. That kind of dualistic picture of the human person is really, really common. It's deep within our culture. We have it without realizing it. We inhabit it without realizing it a lot of the time. And I think, does that seem familiar to people? Do people recognize what I'm describing? I'm pleased that I'm seeing looks of recognition. It's there, and we all think like that. The language of prayer, the language of hymns, it's all over the show. And we get so used to thinking in that way that we read scripture that way, we read the Christian tradition that way, even though actually certainly the Hebrew Bible, and I would argue swathes of the New Testament as well, do not think like that. For the Hebrew Bible, well, to start off with, all creation is good. Right at the beginning, God sees what God has made and it is good. In the material world, including our bodies, but also there isn't really this sense of the inner bit of the human being which is more important. That's much more an idea you get in Greek philosophy. Very roughly speaking, to oversimplify things a lot. But broadly speaking, that idea is alien to the Hebrew Bible, but comes in from elsewhere, comes in from, in particular, Greek philosophy into Western thought. Once we realize that this way of thinking about things is not compulsory. We realize that we don't have to think that the mental bit of us is so much more important to God. And that takes the pressure off, weirdly. That stops us putting it on a pedestal. It stops us thinking, because once you think that the Christian life is all to do with the inner life, the mental life, and not to do with the body, you think that mental experiences are much more important than what we would call bodily experiences, and that distinction in itself is problematic, but we all work with it. And that mental distress, therefore, particularly deserves to be baptized. Mental distress is of God, is an opportunity to encounter God, and that leads to the kind of thing I was talking about, the kind of baptizing distress. So that's kind of the state of my thinking on this. I think that we're behind the game on mental distress. We've learned as Christians and as a wider society to not see physical pain as good. We've broken away from the kind of quite masochistic spiritualities of the past. But we're behind the game on mental distress, and the reason for that, I think, is that a lot of us are dualists. A lot of us still have this view of the human person as divided up, and the mind as particularly important, the mind as a particular place of encounter with God. And what we should do is just realize that being a dualist is not compulsory. So that there's that. Where does that leave us? I think it leaves us with probably something like Tasia's potentially transformative view. Because what we don't want, we need to be so careful making minute distinctions in this area of religion and mental health. What we don't want to say, of course, is that people can't grow through the experience of mental illness, that mental illness can't be the occasion of God working. God can work through what God wants to work through. God can work through the cross. God does work through the cross. And God can certainly work through mental distress. But at the same time as saying that, we need to recognize that it doesn't always happen. So we don't be prescriptive. We don't say to people, oh, just wait and God will work through it, because it sometimes doesn't happen. And that's a great mystery why that doesn't happen. You know, it's part of the mystery of evil in the world, that there is just pain that doesn't heal in this life. but that's how it is, and we shouldn't deny that. And neither should we sort of provide people with timetables or sort of expectations that things will get better spiritually, because they just sometimes don't. But with those provisos, I think it's really, really important to be open to potential transformation and to hear people's stories when those stories come, because they're often great and inspiring. So that's kind of where I'm at, ending up in a sort of potentially transformative place with the emphasis on the potentially. Do people have any questions or comments about what I've just said about my own interests? Yeah. Can we have the microphone?
It's not really like a standout thing, but I find it really interesting what you're saying about people saying going through that pain is always beneficial, because from recent experiences, I've had, while going to too much detail, I had an injury that made my mental health drop quite a lot for a long time, and then I've come out the other end, and then I've met people who've gone, well, at least you've gone through it, that's the pain you've gone through, you'll learn from that. And I'm thinking, you don't really understand what it was I was going through, you're just making like a comment about necessary thinking, and I thought that was quite interesting that you've highlighted there.
Yeah, people do it. Thank you. It's really irritating, personally. I think people sometimes want to say something helpful, and sometimes you can't, sometimes you just have to listen. So there's that sort of temptation there to always say something positive. I think people also really have a hard time with the idea that there are experiences that are just negative, that no good comes out of. They want to sort of redeem every bit of human experience and sort of make them worthwhile. And I think as Christians, at least, we need to resist that, because we should have the confidence to say that it's not up to us to make sense of every bit of reality, that's actually God's job, that redemption of the world in God's good time and weaving it all into a narrative that makes sense is God's job. The temptation to try to redeem the world ourselves, which is another version of Pelagianism, which was talked about earlier, is a really sort of besetting and quite insidious, quite nasty thing, because you see it with all sorts of phenomena. You see it with war, for example. You see it with poverty. You take any human evil you like. People will always try to find a way it fits neatly into a narrative where history is just going up and up, and we should resist that, both at the personal and at the corporate level, I would say.
Compassion and the human response to when somebody's going through something or being something is to try and be empathetic, but it usually comes out in a sympathetic way that can be irritating. My 15-year-old son, he's 17 now, at 15, he said to me, Mum, I don't need you to fix me. I need you to listen. I need to process this. You can't save me. I just need you to listen. And when you said about the dualism, that made me think that of the statement that it's mind over matter, but it's not. It's on an equal footing.
Yeah, definitely. We're bodily beings, right? And what happens with our bodies affects what happens with our thought. After all, that's how psychiatric drugs work. So that's, but I really like what you said about, what your son said about not fixing. That can be the most difficult situation to be in. It's to be the person who has to accompany someone with mental health issues, I think is much more challenging in a way than having a definite job, being a psychiatrist or a therapist, because then your job is in a way to fix, and you've got a definite role. But just to be there, to accompany, to not have something you can do other than that most valuable human thing of all, which is love the person, is a real challenge. And I think people doing that need support. I mean, we talked a bit earlier about how churches can support people with mental illnesses. I think it's also important that churches support people caring for people with mental illnesses, and that wider society does, because that can be such a challenging and an important role. I mean,
unfortunately, I suppose me and my son, so we both got mental health issues, so we are pretty much triangle when it comes to things like that. So if it's not one, support the other. So yeah, when he said to me about that, I just want you to listen, that made me, gave me the vision of telling him about sitting at the foot of the cross and just saying, this is where you need to rest. If I'm not around, I know I'm in your heart, but rest at the foot of the cross, because that's the same thing that you're asking me to do. Does that make sense?
it really does. I think, yeah, anything anyone else wants to say?
Just one at the back.
Right.
You said about the mystery of evil, and you also said that we're kind of ahead of the game in terms of sort of like destigmatizing or almost not fetishizing physical suffering and pain, but we're not quite there when it comes to mental health. Do you think that that is more a cultural thing, or do you think it's an education thing? Do you think that we know more about the body and people are just genuinely less educated about the vast array of mental health issues, and that maybe is education a good tool, or is it more like cultural, spiritual?
It's a really good question. I think it's a bit of all sorts of things. We do, in general, and this is in general, and we need to be careful not to generalize, but in general, we understand psychiatric illness slightly, not slightly, considerably less than we understand common somatic illnesses. So our understanding of what causes them, our understanding of effective treatments, our understanding of prognosis, all that sort of stuff is behind. And there's a fear of the unknown, therefore. There's a fear of something we don't fully understand that could grip any of us and will grip quite a few of us during our lifetimes. So there's definitely a fear of the unknown. I think there's also a cultural thing about what we value about ourselves, particularly in Western societies, our rationality. And this is heavily gendered, by the way, and heavily racialized and all sorts of other things, the way we think about it. But our rationality is central to who we are. And therefore, things that can affect our rationality, can make us less rational, in quote marks, are feared. And the way we deal with things we fear is to bury them, to not talk about them, to create stigma around them, to use euphemism and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's kind of partly just not understanding it so well, partly that stuff to do with rationality, partly, as I say, within Christian circles, certainly the association of the spiritual with the mental, and that being particularly important to God, So there's a whole wave of factors at play, but it's a definite thing. We're behind the game, and I think church is more than wider society slightly. I think there's a particular. I don't know. Perhaps I don't know what others think, but perhaps there's something about how we think about our relationship to God. If we think about our relationship to God as particularly to do with thought, as particularly to do with standing in a kind of personal relationship of a particular thought, then things that make us not capable of that sort of thought or relationship make us particularly afraid that our relationship with God has been affected. So there might be a bit of fear there as well. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that or anything else for that matter? Yeah, because in a way, the sort of people who most need to be here are the least likely to be here, if you see what I mean. It's precisely the kind of person who's got lots of helpful advice to offer who thinks they have nothing to learn. What to do about that? I think it's going to be a slow process. There's other things we can point to that churches have been through quite slow and ongoing learning processes about. So gender and sexuality would be the obvious two I'd point to. And the way things happen with them is that initially quite a small group of people started talking about things, having meetings like this. And that people had conversations and more conversations and more conversations. And you use the language of trickling down. I think that's kind of right. I think persistence is needed. I think support, so regular things like this, I think are important. I think, but also being gentle with ourselves, because you're absolutely right to point out that it's difficult for a lot of us to talk about this stuff. And there's part of me that would, having sort of made it part of my job is perhaps not the best thing from this point of view, but I did. But wants to sort of run and hide from it all. And I think understanding that's also important. So, taking care of people and saying to someone you know might have found a conversation difficult, are you okay? Because it's going to be a long haul, because it's going to be need a lot of persistence, it's important that we take care of one another as we go on, I think.
But even just asking the question, are you okay, if we phrase it like that, can presuppose a positive answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we need to challenge and to model ways of asking questions like that, like you said earlier, we ask with the best of intentions, but it assumes that you'll give me a positive answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
We need to challenge to give a positive answer. Yeah.
And it's being willing to listen to the real answer.
Or dig a bit deeper.
Yeah. If
There's a question at the back there, or a comment at the back. I think on the stigma thing, I think it's really mixed. I think secular society I mean, it's been Mental Health Awareness Week, hasn't it? I guess that's why we're meeting this particular Saturday. But I listen to Six Music, the radio station, when I'm in the car, and it's been constant this week, sort of mental health stuff, which has been good in a certain sort of way. There's been a lot of, here's how to relax, here's some relaxation stuff, here's, let's talk about calming, that sort of thing. So there's an awareness of mental health at a certain sort of level, but a bit like the analogy that was made earlier, sort of it can be like comparing, I don't know, a cold with heart disease or something. Sort of the more serious mental illnesses, I think there is still a stigma around. So once someone starts seeing or hearing something strange or having thoughts that don't fit into a sort of rational thought pattern, then people get very uncomfortable. But those people above all else need help and support and can be left feeling more lonely by the more general awareness of mental illness, because they feel they're even more beyond the pale. Because people will talk about being anxious, and I don't mean to diminish anxiety for a second, which can be very severe, but that's a topic people are getting comfortable about talking about. Talking about hallucination, that doesn't happen so much. And so and I think eating disorders, there's still a big stigma around. I think there's an incredible stigma around eating, particularly in men. Allowed to say?
That it was because people's perception is eating disorders is not always the same as to what I explained to you.
No, absolutely. They've got a stereotypical image of what it is and who it is, and that again just leaves people feeling more lonely if they don't fit into it. Yeah.
There's also a point that just came to my mind is that the idea of talking about mental health at the moment is some people might perceive it as we're doing this because it's not a conversation that happened for, let's say, the old generation. But like, I'm 23 and I didn't have any discussion about mental health. We had no session, and on school events about teaching things, we had none of that. And it's like the eating disorder stuff, that's not even, they're not even like having a conversation about. And I went to a church movement school, so we talked about theology about it, like that wasn't even a process at all.
Well, you just mentioned school. I got a telephone call from one of the pastoral workers to ask me to tell my son to talking about his mental health because the other children in the year weren't mature enough to understand about mental health. I went, well, I think that is your downfall then.
Yeah.
You should be teaching about it, especially when we get to the GCSE year, when their mental health suffers. I won't tell him to stop and don't make him feel like he should. That was a school pastoral worker.
I think it's always worth, I find it helpful at least to compare how we treat mental health with how we treat somatic health. you can not really imagine a child who had broken a limb or had an infectious illness or something like that being told, don't talk about it. You just couldn't imagine it. And, you know, from a Christian perspective, we should challenge that. We're unities. We're created by God, body and mind, mind and body, minded body. And all of it matters. All of it is precious to God. All of it is brought into communion with other people. And we shouldn't hide this aspect of ourselves. We shouldn't be made to hide, because it's often not us doing it. It's, as you say, people like... There's not really much to say about that, is it? It's just disgusting.
We're touching on it with the mental distress that impacted back.
I just think it's important to highlight because obviously we've been talking about it as like not necessarily just conditions of like diagnosed conditions, like especially people doing exams nowadays that can bring on a lot of anxiety, and they're just I know some teachers could brush it over as going, well, you'll experience it then, and then once your exam's over, that's it. You'll never think about it again. When they're not reflecting on the trauma that caused that person during that process.
There's a real epidemic. I mean, I use that word quite deliberately of feeling anxious around assessment, not only in schools but in universities. I see it constantly. The number of students I have coming into my office, real states about the exams, and it ties into what Tasia was saying about the social and structural elements of this, because kind of what are we as a society doing that's making people so anxious, that's making young people feel their entire life rides on this one assessment in some cases. And, you know, things like the economic situation of students plays into it as well, because there's a real sort of need to pass and do well in exams to pay off loans. Things like that, get a job and pay off loans. So we need to think about it in a joined-up way, but again, just awareness. So for churches, if you're in a church that has a large number of students, has schools, things like that, these are not trivial experiences. It's not the kind of thing it's helpful to say you do it and you put it to bed, because it doesn't work like that. It can be really a real upheaval.
I don't think there's enough pastoral or counselling for people that are going through that. Yes, we've always taken exams, we've always had that pressure, but there's more pressure to high achieve, to get the places that you want or need these days as well. There's less job security. The pressure is ratcheted up so much, I think. I'm conscious of the time. Should we talk a bit about some of the stuff we brought up earlier? We were talking about the experience of exile, for example. Do you want to say a bit more about why that occurred to you as a theme?
Because it's relevant.
Yeah.
And I think even now, the news from Ukraine is slipping down. It's not always first at 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock or on the news bulletin that you listen to. It's slipping down that hierarchy of how we prioritise what the news that we share. But the consequences of war and horror are going to be lifelong. And the trauma that the men, the women, the children of all generations will be affected by is lifelong. And it's how we become more equipped to live with that and live alongside it, and attempt to deepen our understanding of the effect of that trauma.
I had an Ethiopian asylum seeker staying with me for a few months last year through a local charity, and his mental well-being was just, because of the absolute experience of insecurity, you could see it happening, you know, am I going to be allowed to stay? I've been to this meeting with these people, it's inconclusive. I'm not sure how long I'll be living here, and all that radical insecurity about every aspect of his life. You could just see, it was very sad to watch, just his moods and his mood decline, his level of anxiety increase. I think we've got resources in the Christian tradition that don't make it all okay, but which assure people that God accompanies them through those experiences. So he was an Ethiopian Orthodox Christian, and was very taken with an icon in the house, which was of Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus going into exile in Egypt. So could see in that his own experience. So sort of accompanying people and somehow relating their story to the stories that are told in the Bible is something that churches can do and do have the resources to do. I think the problem, well, a problem, there's many problems, but a problem is just awareness of what, because we get such a lot of rubbish about asylum seekers and refugees through our media, that people's image of what life is like for an asylum seeker or a refugee is just, is completely unreal. And so understanding that people have that radical insecurity and understanding the effects that can have, because if you read the newspapers, you'd think people were living the life of Riley in a sort of penthouse suite, and you know, it's ridiculous. Whereas actually, you don't know where you're going to be living from week to week. You've got, well, through the charity, the asylum seeker I hosted had been turned down on initial application, so had no recourse to public funds at all, had no access to money. The charity gave him £30 a week. How he was supposed to live off that, I've no idea. But that kind of situation, and just, again, telling the stories, actually, just people understanding that that's what it's like.
So, I know you referred to exile. So, how do we, as a church, sit or walk back beside people in their wilderness? Because it is a wilderness. It's so insecure and unforeseen that you've got the trauma, you've got the not knowing. How do we come along somebody and help other than organisations within the church?
How do we as a church community do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Either walk with somebody or sit with somebody. I mean, to be in exile, it just feels like you're abandoned, doesn't it? You say exile, it's like you're displaced.
The thing I've found most helpful in churches is feeling like I've got permission to not be okay, if that makes sense.
Yes.
There can be ways of doing Christian spirituality that make it like you've got to be happy all the time. So it came up a bit with the joy stuff in Tasia's talk. And again, we've got the resources there. We've got the sort of symbolism of the cross. We've got the symbolism of exile. We can talk about these things and
should, but we often don't. We often leave it with this sort of, if you're not having a completely wonderful time all the time, you've not got it, or there's something wrong with you. And that's, I think having communities, therefore, that are more emotionally balanced, and that affects how we do liturgy, that affects how we do spirituality, that acknowledge the sort of sadness of human life, that acknowledge the difficulty. And there's not a recipe for that, but being aware of the need to do it, I think, is a good start.
I agree with the acknowledgement and having sermons and scripture around those times, and actually bringing it more to the forefront of, yes, we do look at joy, peace, patience, kindness, but what about your sadness, your brokenness, your lost? You've got a parable of the lost sheep. Go into that. You've got Exodus. Yes, God provides the manna and the quail, but how would those people at the time feel in that lost place, being displaced? And you can make it relevant today. It's more about the clergy or whoever speaking, bringing it to us so that we can reflect and pray and process.
Definitely, I think that's really rich. I was reminded by you talking about the manna and the quail that you'd raised this issue earlier of around eating disorders and the food symbolism. I think that's so important. I think it's an issue we need to think about as Christians, because it is so central to our worship. I mean, think about the Eucharist, our scriptures, food and drink, constantly a sign of God's love for God's people. I am the bread of life, etc., etc. I think pastoral work. I think we can't. There's a sense in which we can't do anything about that. It's part of Scripture. It's part of the tradition. We couldn't not mention it in church, but we need to be aware of how that might resonate with people in ways different from the way it resonates with most of us, and we need to, be sensitive to that. But also, I think people working on a sort of one-to-one basis with people in their spiritual lives, so clergy, pastoral workers, people like that, need to realise that not all symbols will work or be appropriate for all people, and need to have that awareness. So,
there's the economic crisis as well.
Yeah. And the effect of that on food. Yeah. It's very, so I'm useless at chapter and verse stuff, but there's a psalm that talks about God feeding all of God's children. That sounds very different if you're struggling to make ends meet. Why is God not feeding me, etc. It's about awareness of how things are heard, isn't it?
I think it's just as a society now, with a lot of it has come, you're out for yourself, you're independent, and there's not that tapestry that there used to be generationally. Working with the Lunch Club that I've been doing since December, seeing that again generationally, I would hope as a church we could get that back and support each other, because wartime people went through rations, so it can be done, but bringing it with our faith, bring our faith alongside it. I hope I'm not making presumptions, but it did seem that a lot of people within the war did believe in God, did pray, and survived. And although we are broken these days, and we're more open about how we're broken is, I can't think of the word I'm looking for. It's okay not to be okay.
It is, and I mean, just theologically, at the heart of the Christian faith is the idea that God in Christ has not been okay, that God in the person of Christ suffers and shares our suffering and is in solidarity with us in our suffering, and I think it's really important to hold on to that. I think community's so important to be part of the problem in our society, and we've been talking about what community should do, and a large part of the issue is that there isn't very much community very often in society and sometimes in churches, to be honest. And it's an important part of what the church is called to be, I think. What we're called to do is image the kingdom of God, to show people what God's kingdom is like, to live out that kingdom already present as a seed growing in the midst of the world. And we need to get better at doing that, not just because of issues around mental health, but it's a precondition for dealing adequately with issues around mental health that we do have decent communities. So perhaps part of what I take home from this, I mean, my own parish is bad at this stuff, but we need to be stronger communities in order to be able to support people within our community. So we need to do the normal sort of community building stuff in order to have this particular care for people with mental health issues, because there just won't be, if you don't have a community, to have a strong community, it's almost senseless to talk about what the community should do. So there's kind of a need for attention to the basics, I think.
Do you think, in terms of, having a strong basis of community, or pockets of that, you spoke before about those kind of, certain aspects of mental health agendas. Do you think that there's a gender imbalance that's reflected in the church, or within a certain Christian faith that is also present with mental health? Like, traditionally, men are supposed to not talk about their feelings, whereas women, it's acceptable. Men are supposed to be kind of stronger. If we're going for total stereotypes, if that makes sense. Yeah. Is that reflected in a spiritual sense as well, do you think, even now? Or is it not as much of an issue?
Definitely. I think it's definitely an issue. So I think
because I'm a woman, and I really struggle talking about things, and I can imagine if I was a guy, I would find that practically impossible in certain circumstances, I think.
yes, and there are traditions where it's positively encouraged. I mean, particularly in the US, but not entirely absent here, is talk about Christian manhood and stuff like this, which is this very sort of butch sort of image of upright, sturdy men who rarely talk about anything deep. I think gendering of women, expectations of women, particularly, around role in the family and things like that, can put real pressure on mental health. So I think both men and women get it, have negative impacts on their lives because of gendered expectations. They're different. So some mental illnesses are more likely to occur in men, some in women. Particular problems with rate of suicidality amongst men. and that's often been tied to the not talking about feelings. But then women as the victims of sexism get, so things like mood disorders are particularly prevalent in women, and that's often been tied to the experience of sexism. So where am I going with this? I think all of those... So I think the church has historically made things worse. I think all churches, to be honest, have made things because just historically churches have been one way in which patriarchy, in which sexist relationships have reproduced themselves, have been made real in society. I think, as we were saying earlier actually around the conversation with mental health, there's been, because of things like feminist theology in the past half century in particular, there's been a growing awareness, better in some churches than others. My own church is bad at this stuff, but there has everywhere to an extent been a growing awareness, so we've got less bad. But we still... Look, there's still stuff in the Bible that is just on the face of it damaging in gender terms, that encourages the subordination of women to men, encourages sort of a certain type of masculinity. So I think people doing things like preaching or leading Bible study have a job to actually engage with those texts, challenge ideas and stuff like that, not just sort of put them to one side and hope no one notices, because people will notice and do bad things on the basis of them. Yeah, sorry.
Similar to that, sort of linking to what I asked about earlier with sexuality. I know this is not the same with everyone's opinions on it, but based on what we saw earlier about a sin being can be a cause of mental health, from some perspectives, they see sexuality as a sin. So if we can learn it that way, that's them saying that some sexuality is a mental health. Which I think, if you put it in that perspective, it's quite mad that that's still a thing. Because I said when you were about doing Bible study, and when I was talking about gender stuff, but with that, I had to talk about sexuality and try to teach these young people about like what I feel should be a way to look at it, and then the person that's helping me doing it, when he did his bit, went the other way and said that they're sinners, they're always going to be sinners, that's just them. And I was just like, what's the best way of addressing that in a way that, like, because I know some people turn up their nose when you make some of those suggestions. Again, not everyone, but some people do it. It's like trying to work out a balance of not, I don't know, causing too much drama on it, I guess, or trying to normalise the conversation, I guess.
So I think it's a really good question how we engage with this stuff. I'm just going to wrap up in a second, but it's important we have those conversations not for the sake of the person who's a hardened bigot, but for the sake of the person who's sitting there listening and perhaps might, you know, be LGBT and doesn't have the courage or the, you know, it's important that Christians are heard to be saying progressive things about sexuality for the sake of a much wider range of people than their most vocal opponents. Just saying, I don't read the Bible that way, I think God loves everyone regardless of their sexuality, might sort of just be what someone needs to hear who's sitting in the back very quietly. So I just encourage you to keep on saying those things. We should stop because people are coming in for lunch, but thank you so much for that. I learned so much from that, so thank you very much. Sorry, that was quite a short answer to